titled Migrating from Batch to Continuous Improvement. I am Jerry Strohmeyer, the Education and Training Program Coordinator for AME, and I will be your moderator. Today's presenter is Bo Keat, the president of the Keat Group. Bo spends his time doing what he does best, helping clients adapt and innovate by building new internal capabilities at all levels of their organization. He excels at listening, teaching, facilitating, and coaching in ways that enable organizations to improve performance and embrace the cultural changes for future success. Bo is a frequent conference speaker and an adjunct faculty member of the Lean Enterprise Institute and a coach for the Masters of Business and Operational Excellence program at Ohio State University. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You will see that you are muted on your attendee panel on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into your question area in the attendee panel and click on Submit. We will review the questions at the end of today's presentation and answer as many as we can. When you log off today, please check your email inbox, and it will be an invitation and link to fill out a short webinar attendee survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey today, as your feedback is very important to us to improve future webinars. Bo has also graciously agreed to provide a PDF of today's presentation. We will be sending that along with a recorded link for a webinar replay to each of you next week. Now I am pleased to introduce Bo Keat, who will present from Migrating from Batch to Continuous Improvement. Take it away, Bo.
Great. Thanks, Jerry, and good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. I'm happy to be here. What I'd like to do today is spend maybe about 35 minutes challenging the way we think about continuous improvement and then see what you have to say. So I'm talking about, from my perception, my experience, we do a lot of batch improvements, which kind of goes against the rub of continuous improvements. And before we get started, I'd actually like you to write some stuff down. So, where's this? Here we go. Before we move further, I'd like to have you write some stuff down that we can use later on. I'd like you to capture your thoughts on some recent Kaizen experiences. And I'm specifically looking at what you liked or didn't like about the recent experiences. And I want to give you about 60 seconds to do that. And I'm going to stop talking for 60 seconds, and then I'll bring it back up. So please think about it and make some notes. Thanks. Well, that was the longest minute I've ever spent on a webinar not saying anything. I hope you guys made some nice notes. I actually want to use your input later, but please keep those thoughts, and that's what I want to talk about. If you believe that there are some improvements you can make, what we're really talking about is creating continuous improvement on continuous improvement. How do we improve continuous improvement? So the biggest challenge I would have is what would you change and why? I'd also like to share with you my thoughts on what I would change and why, and some examples of how it seems to have helped. So a couple of working definitions first. Just Kaizen. The pure definition of Kaizen is a continuous improvement of an entire value stream or individual process steps to create more value with less waste. And it can happen within the management system or within the work system, either way. A Kaizen workshop, on the other hand, is a group Kaizen activity, commonly lasting 5 days. The 5-day Kaizen is almost a moniker, in which a team identifies and implements a significant improvement in a process. That's my definition of a batch. We wait, and then we have 5 days, and then we wait, and then we have 5 days. That's batch processing to me. So the biggest challenge I have is what's so special about 5 days. And through my experiences, I've actually had this discussion with lots of folks, and I think I've determined that the root of this actually sits with Toyota when they had a group of folks who created acted like external consultants going into the supply base to help the supply base. And from what I can tell and what I've heard, they didn't want to go to more than one city at a time because they didn't want to travel that much, and et cetera. So they decided to stay in one city all week long. And they magically created 5 days worth of work, which was very convenient for their flight schedule, but not necessarily convenient for the customer. And that, I believe, you may argue with me, I'm open to that, but that's my understanding of the origination of 5 days. And from my perspective, it shouldn't be about what's convenient for the external people, the expert coming in. It should really adapt to how much do we need to change, how long will it take, et cetera. I've had Kaizens that lasted 1 hour, and I've had Kaizens that might last a month, depending on what you're working with and what the context is. So I need to challenge 5 days. The other thing that I've actually heard people say, conversations I've heard include folks running up to their manager and saying, listen, I have a really good idea for this problem that we keep on having, and this is what I'd like to try to do. And the manager has said, well, you know, we don't really have any Kaizen activities planned for another month. Could you please hold on to it for another month, because that's when we can talk about change. And once again, it's an example of batching continuous improvement as opposed to somehow understanding how we can try this every day of our life. So some of the concerns I have about some of the current model is what we do between Kaizens. And if I'm talking right now to a bunch of really smart, passionate people who could be experts in some of this thinking, I'm betting some of you have your Kaizens lined up for the next 3 months, which means you may not return to the place today's Kaizen for another 3 months. So what do we do in between? What do these guys do in between? And what I see missing when I observe is that they aren't doing a lot of checking and acting. They did a lot of grasping the situation, they did a lot of planning, they did a lot of doing. But after the doing, then what? Where's the learning to see, are we where we should be or not? And if we're not, what should we be doing differently? So this embedded continuous improvement model is lacking in many cases after a Kaizen experience. I also see missing changes in the management. And it's been my experience that it's really hard to change the work and sustain that change without changing how we manage the work, because how we manage and how we work are joined at the hip. And if you split that off, there's a problem. So unless we also work on a Kaizen approach for how we manage differently, chances are we're missing something and we're not going to get the results we need, or we're not going to be sustainable. So when I look at a gap to address, just putting on my A3 thinking hat, there is a gap where now many of us are at event-based learning, which means we wait and we have an event, and we make changes during the event, but not in between events. We get lots of people involved, that's good. We have lots of people doing thinking and learning, that's good too. I challenge if they're the right ones. Who's doing the thinking and learning? Are the people who are in the workplace doing the thinking and learning, or are the experts doing the thinking about what's wrong and what should be changed? We also have new standards design, that's good too. But going back to what we know, standard work is best designed by those who do the work. Who's actually designing the new work standards? Are they the right people or the wrong people? And most importantly, are they thought of as a solution, or are they thought of as a benchmark or a reference point for further continuous improvement? And that's a big gap I've seen in a lot of cases. But that's where we are today. And we have where we might like to be, where we learn how to learn every day. It's integrated into our lives. We're expected to be addressing problems on a daily basis, where we address the management system. We do PDCA on both the management system and the work on a continuous basis. We deliberately engage the staff, and we treat whatever we come up with as the beginning of a journey to get to someplace better, not as a solution where we have to sit. So that's the gap that I see, and that's what I want to address. So I have no problem with this model. I think the model is very strong. It's been proven over and over and over again. I have an issue with how we deploy the model, that we batch it instead of see it as integrated into our lives. So I'd like to introduce a new way to think about Kaizen, where we worry about quick cycles of learning all the time. Quick meaning maybe an hour, maybe a day, maybe a shift, but not waiting for things to occur. And we learn very, very quickly and adjust very, very quickly. And we think about this in terms of small reversible experiments, both scientific thinking and acting, that's good, but small reversible experiments means that we don't want to hit the home run. We just want to start to learn something, and a single is okay. And it has to be reversible because we're doing things we've never done before. And if we see something that puts our customers at risk, our people at risk, our reputation at risk, our patients at risk, we need to stop immediately and regress back and say, you know what, we thought we knew what we were doing. We thought we wouldn't be putting this stuff at risk. We found out we are. We need to stop right now and go back to where we were until we understand how to approach this differently. So small and reversible are key components to thinking differently about Kaizen. But every Kaizen is an experiment. And in an experiment, you have fundamental things you need to worry about. First of all, what's your theory? Every experiment starts with a theory. What's your theory? What's your hypothesis of what should occur? How are you going to test it? How will you observe it to see whether, to gather data on this test? And how will you analyze it to see whether or not it's proving or disproving your theory or hypothesis? And finally, get to the point of confirming or rejecting once you take a look at what's really going on. And I'd like to spend some time going through some of this, starting off with grasping the situation. We use tools today to help us grasp the situation. We use a current state value stream map. We might go to the Gemba. We might do some A3 problem solving to find out what are we dealing with and how good are we today? How good or bad is the performance today that we have to deal with? And then we worry about how big the gap is. So we have tools like the future state map or very specific A3 goal that's developed after we analyze what's going on, or may have a business want or need that we have to grow by 10% without adding more staff. We may have a very specific business goal to meet. And these are the types of things we need to do to help grasp the situation. At that point, one thing I want to actually pause with you on is the bullet point at the top of the page. I have no doubt that people on this phone are passionate about the work they do. However, their role may shift depending on whose problem it is to solve. So once you define the problem, and if you figure it's your problem to solve, which means it's in your workplace, you're actively inside this problem, it's your sandbox, then you get to lead the effort. If not, if you're simply a support function or expert that helps other people think, they need to lead the effort because it's their experiment, it's not yours. They have to do the learning. So then your role is to facilitate the effort and help them learn how to learn. So once you get that figured out, you have to start out with hypothesis. So we expect a very specific performance improvement by changing X. So we expect to be able to admit patients 2 hours earlier if we move a physician into the ER, for instance, just as an example. It's a very specific hypothesis. An alternate could be, what would occur if we were to move people around and run the work through our department, and we just shuffled people up or changed the work? What would occur? That's a perfectly good hypothesis, too. And then once we figure that out, we obviously need a cross-functional team to represent the folks inside that sandbox of that problem that we scoped out. So before I go further, I actually want you to make just a few notes. I'll give you a few seconds to make some notes, and that might help some question and answer period later on. So let me give you about 15 seconds. Okay. Next, we just grasped the situation. Let's go on to planning. There are some themes here. How can we make it small and reversible? We want to learn a little bit at a time, and we want to be able to pull back if we see something bad happen. How quickly can you learn and adjust? I worked with an accounting group. They were doing some experiments that they could adjust quickly and learn day by day. There are other things they could only learn once a month with the cycle of the closing of the books. So it depends, but the challenge is how quickly can you learn and adjust? What risks you need to avoid in terms of risk to the business, risk to the people, risk to the patients. I worked with a healthcare company who was very concerned about patient safety. They were changing how they brought people back from the waiting room to the ER to their patient rooms, and there was a chance they could physically not see the people in the waiting room, and that's dangerous, or could be dangerous. So they had to be very careful about making sure that they could see the patients as they were waiting for services, and that's something that they worried about in their design. And finally, how can you engage the minds of the people who live within the scope of the project? Because once you do, you excite their scientific ability or their curiosity possibly to try something different and see if it works. So if you're working with engineers or physicians or clinicians, people who've been trained in scientific thinking, you get to re-excite their scientific training that they had a long time ago. If not, you're working with people who have never been trained in that, you get to raise curiosity about, gee, let's try something to see if it works, but it has to be very deliberate. It has to be a very deliberate experiment. But once we do that, we have no idea if it worked or not. So let me see. Yes. Next piece is how do we engage people differently? We don't want just the A team showing up and doing the work. We actually want to include as many people as possible in the design and the execution of the experiment. And if you do that, you stand a much better chance of them accepting what's going on because they're part of the thinking. They're part of the piloting. And that's a really good space to be in. When will it occur and for how long? Progressive experiments basically means we're going to start small and keep on building on it. So one example is back to the emergency room. They wanted to try something very different. So they decided to try in the middle of the night where there weren't a lot of patients arriving so they could kind of shake it out and feel good about it. But once they got comfortable that they thought they were on the right path, they go to a higher demand time or a longer duration of the test, et cetera. They kept on progressing to more and more and more patients and more and more and more parts of the week until they had the entire thing enveloped and they had a new standard. And that's an example of a progressive experiment. How are you going to get feedback? Both technical and social. You're going to get performance data back. Are you also getting thoughts of the people living there to say, you know what, it seems to be a little clunky, or this is really great, or it works except over here it's really hard. How are we getting that feedback? Because one way or another, you have to be able to design something that works well inside the workplace. So that was the end of planning. I kind of rushed through that. I do have an example later on, but I wanted to give you, once again, about 15 seconds to make some notes, so we can cover them at the end. Okay, on to the next piece. We covered grasping the situation. We covered planning. How about doing? So we're getting ready to try something new, something that's never been tried before. And if you can, it'd be great to do a dry run. And also run through how you're going to actually collect the data. Now, the data, I didn't cover this before, it's great to have outcome data. Everyone wants a better outcome. But it's also important to understand which pieces of the pilot influence the outcome and measure that too. So if you wanted to be able to reduce the exceptions at the end of a month when you close the books, what are you going to measure upstream to see what's happening with exceptions? So is it people using the wrong template? Is it stuff coming in too late? Is there confusion about the accuracy of some report? What do you need to measure to understand what influences the outcome and measure that too? And that's the performance feedback. So you have in-process measures and outcome measures. And then you talk and socialize it with everybody. You run it, and then you interview what the people live through. And that's the social feedback as part of the transformation also. So you have a little bit of technical in terms of how the performance is improving, and you have a whole bunch of social in terms of what they were feeling, what went well, what didn't go well, how might they think about it differently in terms of the process to make it a more acceptable new standard. Then we go on to, I'm sorry, that was doing. And once we've run it for a while, this could be at the end of the day, it could be at the end of the week, whatever your cycle is. Take a look at what the people are saying. Take a look at the data, and you have some choices. Based on what you see, you have choices. You can repeat the original experiment in slightly different circumstances, such as, gee, it worked on this shift, I wonder if it works on the next shift. Or, gee, it works in this field office, let's try another one and see what happens. And see if you have something going, a good trend. Or you could say, you know what, we really didn't get all we wanted out of it, but we were close. So let's think through some modifications to make, and then we'll rerun the experiment and see what happens. And that's your adjustment. Or it could just fall flat, and all your assumptions were wrong. We thought our hypothesis was ABC. Guess what? We were wrong. It didn't do any of this. Or it created risk. So we're going to scrap the whole thing, go back to ground zero, and say, okay, how do we think about this differently so we can start to test our way to a new solution? Or if everything is great, how do we implement it as the new standard? So, and then move on from there. Use that as the basis for improvement. And then we go on to acting and adjusting in terms of what that adjustment is, if any. If you don't have any, then formalize the standards and visuals, and then worry about the management system to support it. So that's going through PDCA very quickly to talk about the model and how to approach it in experiments. I think some of this is not new to you. As I said, the model is solid, but the change in thinking is how do we do it quickly and nimbly rather, and do fast cycles of learning that we can reverse if something goes wrong. And also, how do we engage more people? How do we have them do more thinking? So I want to go on to an actual example, but before that, I'd once again like to give you some time to make some notes, and we can use that as input for questions soon. Okay, I've been talking really fast, so I thought I'd ground everybody with an example. And to do this, I'm actually going to escape out of PowerPoint presentation and go to this so I can do some drawing. This is a real live example. It popped up in November of last year. I was working with an accounting organization, a centralized accounting function, which got transactions from the field, and they had to use these transactions to help close the books. And they had some exceptions, and they're having problems with exception processing. So this is a very cursory value stream map just to demonstrate the process to you. And up here on the top left, we see exceptions arriving from the field office. And then the folks in the trenches, they document what's going on, and they ask the field office what to do. Hey, this doesn't quite match. It doesn't fit very well into our round hole. So what do you want us to do with this information? And they would send out what they called a ticket with all the information the field office needed to scratch your head on about and then respond. And they would wait 6 days, and if they didn't hear from the people, they'd ask again because they still needed an answer. So after 6 days, they got about a 20% response rate coming in, and they'd ask again. Same question, same ticket. They'd go up here, field office, wait 6 days, and lo and behold, it didn't improve, it got worse. You only got a 10% response. So it asks again, send the same old ticket up, please help me, please direct me, and they got a 5% response. These are very close to the actual numbers. So what we have down here is the reality. The more times they ask, the less response they got, which is counterintuitive. And that's where they were sitting. So what the heck do you do with this? Accepted resolution with the process, did a value stream map and a problem breakdown, and their grasp of the situation was asking more than once has a limited impact. So their hypothesis was changing the first encounter. So let me step back for just a moment. When you look at that map, there are probably 12 different things you might come up with in terms of things you'd like to change or hypotheses you'd like to check out. This is what they landed on. It doesn't mean it's what you would land on. This is what they landed on with the agreement among the teams of very frustrated people who were trying to do the right work. They said their hypothesis was changing the first encounter and removing all the nagging, and they actually called it nagging all the time, that they were forced to do, will improve the responses. That was their hypothesis. So how did they go about doing this? Going back to the slides I presented on tactical design, what specific questions do you want answered? And this is their response to that question. They actually had this stuff written on a wall. Their response was, what nudge appeals to them and makes a difference? What should you measure? We're going to measure the number of exceptions that come in and the dollar value. And what I didn't add here was how was after the first nudge. After the first nudge. That was implicit. What specific changes will be made, which means what new standard are we going to live with or going to try? They wanted a very specific conversation with very specific people by email. So they wanted to shake it up and be very deliberate about this, because it was kind of a gunshot approach, shotgun approach. Who will be involved and what will be their new tasks? Central accounting, the field office managers, and the field office accountants. They had bookkeepers at each field office. And they had very specific tasks throughout the pilot to respond, to track, to see what's going on, and get feedback, and also measure the performance. How will you collect the data? They wanted to do frontline notations. This is central accounting for how many we get. They wanted to save the emails in terms of how they phrased what was going on and the information they got back on directions to resolve the exceptions. And they decided to check weekly for the month. So they don't want to wait till the end. They want to actually jump on it as soon as the exceptions started coming in. And they had previously waited until last week, and it was a big mess. Who would check the data and how often? They had the front line at central operations, and regional managers would check the data together on a weekly basis. So they decided to run for 2 months. When will it occur and how long? They want to run it for 2 months with just one region. And they picked the one that they wanted to try it with. And they had probably, I think, maybe 8 regions in the country. And once they got through it for 2 months, they wanted to add one at a time until they got them all involved, one per month. So you see this as a different variation of a progressive experiment. And each time they would roll it out, they'd check and see what might be different at the next region, and then make some changes as necessary to ensure they got a great first response rate. How we get feedback during and after the pilot? They wanted to deal with daily feedback from Central in terms of a morning huddle, so they talk about it every day, in addition to what was happening on collecting data from the participants, field offices, and Central during the experiment. How will you discuss and socialize the results? Great question, because they had regions, but they had many offices but within the region. So there are a bunch of offices to worry about. There are also about 50 people in the centralized accounting department to worry about. And they decided to land on weekly huddles and monthly huddles with different groups of people between the central and the region. So they're all look at, in these huddles, they all look at the data together, they all look at the input from the staff together, and this is the check on PDCA. And based on that check, they would agree on adjustments between the field and central office. What visuals will you use? They weren't really sure at first, but they landed on trend tracking on the response rate and the dollars resolved. And then for those that weren't resolved, they wanted to do some problem breakdown on what was really going on with those they couldn't resolve. Was it what conditions couldn't they resolve, and was it always a specific office? Was it always a specific type of transaction or a specific policyholder? Things like that. They want to analyze and get behind it so they could make further improvements. So what I expressed just now, the example I gave you just now, is fundamentally different than my experience and my observations in the traditional 5-day Kaizen. And what I believe that has occurred in this company and what has occurred in this process change, this Kaizen process change, is we've begun to integrate learning into daily lives. It's no longer event-based. These guys are literally thinking of experiments and running them on a weekly basis or less, continuously. They don't need to wait for me. They're just doing it. They're highlighting issues. Let's go after this. They're using their huddles to create more experiments, and they're running free. We also looked at the management system. How do you manage differently? Because it's a very different management system for a very different work process. And the management system is also an experiment. You're not going to get the perfect management on the first swipe. How do you start to learn how to manage differently? And use this as a PDCA for the management system. And the managers in the accounting office were very steeped in learning how do we not do the thinking for the people, how do we not do the work for them, how do we allow them to experiment on their own. We had deliberate engagement with staff. By the time the whole thing was finished, almost everybody on the staff was involved in some part of the experiment for some period of time. So everyone got to try and give input, which means it's a very robust social design that people get it. And they learned very quickly that just because they got a little bit better doesn't mean they solved the problem, and they have to keep on working on a continuous basis to move forward. Now, in this specific instance, they also jumped into different areas of concern within accounting, not just exception resolution. So that's another thing. It's not just a solution here. How do we integrate it elsewhere? And they migrated on their own to other areas. So once again, it's using the same model, but a different approach for that model. So that's a really quick monologue that is nudging what I expect are some very good people on the other end of this line. And that's my challenge to you. If you believe, if you look all the way back on your first set of notes of what you are concerned about with your existing model of continuous improvement, that implies that there's room for improvement on continuous improvement. And my biggest question to you is, what's your hypothesis in terms of what you think you should change and what the impact would be against the challenges you face in your current model? And that wraps it up. This could be a quick lunchtime, but I wanted to just give a quick nudge out there. There are other things to look at. I don't think Jerry mentioned, but I have a book that was released about a year ago, and it won a 2014 Shingle Prize this year. And on Chapter 5, inside the book, there's a really good conversation in text on designing experiments. And if you want to read further, it's a great book for that. It also talks about experiments in the management system, not just in the work processes. There are also some Huffington Post articles I've written, not specific to experiments, but that might kind of titillate your mind a little bit by checking them out. It's under my authorship, Bo Keat. You can search on the Huffington Post. I have 2 up there now. I should have another one in about 3 weeks. And you can obviously get more information on my website. And that's how to learn further. Or you can email me. I'd love to hear from you and help you think through some of the challenges you have or questions you might have. And that's all I have for the formal presentation. Jerry, you want to take it from here?
Sure, great. And thank you, Bo, and congratulations on the 2014 Shingo Prize on your new book. That's great. So now we will review any questions, and if you do have any questions for Bo, please submit them on the right side of your screen, and I will read them. Here's one, Bo. Where would you begin a management system experiment?
Well, I can say you can start anywhere, but the best place to start is within the pilots that you're changing the work in, and leave it there. I wouldn't migrate beyond that until you migrate the pilots. So as you're changing the work, if you can work in parallel with the managers to say, how do we start to manage differently? How do we use visual management? How do we think about our cadence for standard work, things like that, for leadership standard work, things like that. I would have it sit on top of the pilot by design, because the rest of the organization won't make any sense out of it yet. So there are kind of two experiments running at the same time. What are we learning about managing differently to get to a better place? And what are we doing about work process redesign to get to a better place? And then they can be continue to be joined at the hip. Great question. Okay, great. The next one is, how would you say this is different from the daily mindset concept of Kata, or is it the same? That's a great question. I think there are a lot of similarities with Kata. Kata is concerned about work changes and management changes. However, what I've seen in Kata, and my experience might be different than yours, so take that with a grain of salt. What I've seen in Kata is I haven't seen a great deal of strategic alignment to where you do it. And I've talked to frustrated people who kind of, when we first started value stream mapping, this going back to 1999, they had a term called drive-by Kaizens, which means we're running through the plant and boom, we just found one. We're going to drive by and shoot it. Well, let's fix that problem. Let's fix this problem. Let's fix that problem. Drive-by Kaizens. I've seen some evidence of similar thinking in Kata, where we just need to make improvements. We can make them anywhere. Let's start, as opposed to being strategic about what's going on. And what I didn't talk about in my example for the insurance company is that they had a very specific goal that they couldn't meet without breaking through the capacity issue of having all their frontline people chasing after exceptions. And they wanted to build their business without adding staff, and they couldn't do that until they figured out how to reduce that waste. So it was a very deliberate and strategic alignment to that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I'm not sure the engagement and the socialization is the same. When we socialize the experiment, we are talking to all sorts of people about what's going to be different, who wants to play, and even talk to people who might be impacted about it, like other field offices. Hey, this is coming down the pike. We're going to start in this region first, but we'll get to you eventually. And we're using that socialization aspect to make sure that everyone understands what we're doing. What I've seen in Kata, and it might be different in your experiences, this is just mine, is that one way or another, there are a lot of A teams out there, and they're engaging the A teams. And the B teams and the C teams get kind of tired of that. So I think Kata could work, instead of going down this road, you could work with Kata if you made some changes with Kata. Saying, how do we socialize better? How do we talk about the management system, treat that as an experiment? Because I know I'm rambling, but there are actually different things that are pinging at me now. The Kata card with 3 questions, it's more than 3 or 4 questions. It helps to start there, but where are you going with it? That card's not the solution. So how are you learning from that and progressing to something that makes sense inside your culture? So I think that the fundamentals of the Kata are fine. but once again, how it's implemented, I would take exception with in some of the cases that I've seen. Great question, by the way.
Okay, and our next one is, how many people should participate in Kaizen experiment?
The more the better. And this is why. If they are quick cycles of experiments, why not use each cycle with a few different people added each time? And if you have, say, 8 or 9 cycles to get to a new standard, why not involve other people? Because in doing so, they're engaged and they're being asked to contribute and they're not being left out. And the best thing you can do to get buy-in is to not leave people outside the sandbox. So I would encourage you to find ways to find as many people as possible in the experiment, which doesn't mean they all start on day 1 together. It means you're thoughtful about how you're going to run a series of experiments and include different people to get their perspectives and their realities.
Okay, great, thanks. We have another one also relating to Kaizen. The 5-day Kaizen events are an institution in our company. How can I introduce a change like this?
I thought the first time I've heard that question. I actually had an experience where at the Ohio State where I was talking about something similar, and the guy raised his hand and said, my whole job at my company, it was a really well-known big company, is scheduling 5-day Kaizens for my staff. I'm in charge of the central continuous improvement folks, and all we do is schedule 5-day Kaizens. What you're saying might have some merit, but I don't know what to do. And my response is design an experiment. What's your experiment to test the waters on the viability of doing something other than a 5-day Kaizen? So this is an experiment. Making a change has a hypothesis that if you go from 5-day to something more continuous, something great will occur. Well, how do you crystallize that and test it a few times? So I see this as an experiment. Making any change is an experiment, and I go through the same process as what I laid out in my earlier slides to design a pilot for something other than 5 days and just see what happens.
Okay, great, thanks. And looks like maybe we just have one more question, but please feel free to put in your questions if you have any. Designing experiments sounds a lot like DOE. Is that what you mean, or is it different?
I'm going to assume that DOE is the tool design for experiments, or design of experiments, not DOE, design of experiments. It is different. So I think some of the thinking is similar, but I would take you to task as to who does the thinking. DOEs, in my experience, are limited to things that are highly technical and data extensive, data rich. They aren't, there's no social interaction. Well, there can be, I guess, but I've never seen it. I've never seen a social element inside a DOE matrix. And the person who designs it is not the person doing the work, because this is pretty technical stuff. And we need to rely on true experts to figure this out. And I grant you, there are times when we need to do that. But it's fundamentally different from getting people in a room who are frustrated about a problem and say, how can we learn our way towards a future state, as opposed to how do we understand the perfect state? What conditions do we need to have the perfect state? So it's much more technical. It's much more data-driven. The thinking level is different. We use experts instead of frontline folks to do it. So that's what I see as some of the main differences in how we think about that stuff. They're both useful. They're both good. It's been my experience that the experiments I talked about today in the webinar are used for the most part, and occasionally we step back and say, listen, this really needs a DOE. It's different.
Okay, great, great. And I don't see any more questions, so thank you everyone for your questions. We appreciate it, and thank you, Bo, for a very insightful presentation. This brings our webinar to a close. Our next webinar is scheduled for September 22nd, titled What We Have Learned About Lean Startups. Please visit AME.org webinars under events for more information and to register. And don't forget to fill out the short survey that will be in your inbox. And one of the many benefits of being an AME member is the benchmarking community of practice, which is found on the AME website. Please feel free to review the benchmarking archives and to use the query system to add queries and receive quick responses within the community. Go to the BCOP query system found under the Education and Training tab on the AME.org website. Thank you everyone for attending and have a productive day.